Hello and welcome back to System Agnostic Classes Quarantine Edition. It's caveat time, so please understand that these classes are system agnostic, so they're not part of any particular system that you might be playing, or that you might like, or that might be your preferred definition. They're just concepts. You can name them whatever you want. Also, historical preconceptions and accuracy and all that are not particularly important because we are discussing these classes for play primarily in secondary worlds. Today we are doing combat-oriented classes that have a certain aesthetic component, where the fighting isn't just a means to an end, but a kind of a lifestyle, really. Also, we will be subverting all that at the end a little bit, and it's going to be very interesting. So when I think fantasy duelist, a very particular image comes to mind. Some bloke in gaudily colored clothes, with a mustache probably, fighting other people, light-footed, with like a rapier, or maybe a saber, but most often a rapier. He's quick, he's lethal, and he is not always fair. The weird thing is, the duelist fighting like one opponent at a time isn't a core thing that I am thinking about when I think about duelists, which is odd considering duelists should be, dueling. As a matter of fact, I can't shake this association of duelists being very good at fighting multiple people at the same time, weaving in and out of combat with, clever tactical maneuvers. And I suppose in the role-playing context, dueling isn't really something you want to be core to your character concept, because it's not very conducive to group play. In most combat encounters, everyone will have something to do, and for most fighters, that'll be at least a one-on-one fighting situation where the enemy tries to surround them in some way. And having a duelist that fights like one opponent one-on-one in a sanctioned match, it really gives the party very little to do. Don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of a single character having the spotlight for like a period of time and the rest of the party rooting for them, because right now the story is about them. But it's not something I'd want to build an entire character concept around. So ironically, in RPGs, duelists will have to be good at anything other than dueling. And really that's the thing that you have to be best at, because that's the thing that you're gonna be doing most of the time. So really at the end of the day, the duelist is just a light-footed swordsman that's very quick, doesn't really wear much armor at all, if any. It's basically like a roguish archetype of a fighter. And that's certainly interesting, zipping across the battlefield, doing damage, and at the same time avoiding incoming attacks through feats of acrobatics instead of just tanking it. But I think we can make this make sense even in the context of dueling. The role that duelists perform in society isn't so much the role of the warrior, but the role of a performer. They perform in sanctioned matches competitively against other people. They do this for audiences in ranked tournaments and leagues. They're not usually trained by the military, which prefers well-rounded soldiers that it can use in battle, but by fencing schools with particular styles of swordplay. Instead of being kind of a bit of a jack of all trades in addition to their sword training, they just mastered this particular weapon to a disproportionate extent. And that is an interesting character flaw that you can play with, which is something that many people do with the duelist, like being out of their depth when being in like a marching situation in the wilderness. They're not very good at it. But a master swordsman is still a master swordsman, and as nice as sparring is for training, I can very much picture duelists going out there to attain skills that are outside of what their school teaches. Not only will it give you useful skills to use in duels, but it'll also pay the bills, because frankly, there's probably just a small handful of champions that can actually live off their prize money. Most of the other duelists have to moonlight as something. So that opens up a whole bunch of options. Obviously, the adventurer being the key one that we want, because it's, conducive to party play. But you'd also frequently expect duelists to be part of security teams, be they private or the city watch, maybe training actual military soldiers in advanced swordplay, and also sometimes maybe just straight up rogues stealing things. So after you put in whatever points you use for the initial mastery of being good with swords, you kinda are very open as to how else you design your duelist, and you don't have to stick to any tropes, even though sticking to tropes is kinda cool. Vikings. I mean, what else is there to say? Berserkers are badass in a different way from, like, normal fighters, because while they use a solid variety of weapons and strategic and tactical thinking of warfare to defeat their opponents and gain mastery of the battlefield, Berserkers just get so angry that their enemies die and they don't. I mean, Jesus, they're not even wearing armor most of the time. The core of the Berserker skill set is the Berserker Rage, obviously. It's just this trance of fury where all they can do is fight and use their incredible strength and skills to destroy their enemies. They will just annihilate anything that is in their path, defying the very reality of the situation, doing the craziest things and getting away with it. Nothing can protect their enemies from destruction. They will split mighty shields with a single smash of their axe. They will tear down doors by just barreling into them. And also they will not die even though they're bleeding from 100 different wounds. They'll just keep on going. They actually existed historically and they did all of those things. Historians and archaeologists believe that primarily they did this by using like drugs and kind of learning a kind of battle meditation. It was a very spiritual component to it. And that's kind of crazy if you want to use that in your setting, that the guy is just doing cocaine on the side and then he destroys everyone. That's kind of cool, but you can also do it with magic. The common interpretation of Berserker is that it means bear warrior. So you see the similarities in the aesthetics and the depiction and the core of the whole thing, which is referring to the primal animalistic rage of the bear. And they are mostly depicted as hairy, bare-chested dudes. A heavily associated trope with the Berserker is that they just go so axe crazy that eventually they can no longer distinguish between friend and foe and will attack their allies. And that is very interesting, but you have to be careful with it. It's fine if you do this with enemies, I think. If NPCs, they have this battle rage and you have them, I don't know, roll will checks or just prioritize enemies over allies, I think that's fine. I am like balls deep in Borderlands 3 right now, and I also enjoyed doing this particular thing in Borderlands 2. I'm in the casino heist thing, which I think is a DLC, and I love just sneaking around and shooting the tourists with the sniper rifle so the head blows off and they get super angry and start beating up all of their allies while I'm just back there watching it through the scope. It's beautiful. Plus, if you kite them like that, eventually they're going to be super powerful because they grow in power, and then you can kill them for a lot of loot if you actually manage to do it, because that can get out of hand. Be careful when kiting berserkers in Borderlands. But if one of your player characters is a berserker, you get into problematic territory, because berserkers tend to be very good at doing damage, and you don't want to just wipe out the party wizard because the berserker like rolled a critical hit on role-playing a character flaw. You could for this just say that berserkers have mastered the art of the battle trance so much that they don't actually attack their allies. That's just a myth, that's not something that happens. And I think most systems do it this way. Or it would be good if the party, or at least someone in the party, knew how to calm the berserker down when shit hits the fan and they really lose control. This is good for like party cohesion and making interesting character relationships while still maintaining an element of danger. And if that happens and like everything fails and the usual calming methods don't work, the GM should take control of the barbarian and the party should have options prepared beforehand on how to tranquilize him and take him down without anyone getting like seriously injured or, you know, dead. As far as character flaws go, it's one of the most interesting but also one of the most dangerous to play with mechanically. So it's very important that you talk about this with your players beforehand, at least with the one that's playing the Berserker. Of all the classes here, Gladiators are by far the most performative. I mean, Berserkers are mostly used on the battlefield, and even Duelists are entertainment for more highbrow, cultured people who want to see a competitive performance. Gladiators are basically wrestlers. I mean, yeah, their battles are rarely scripted, though that would be a very interesting idea to play with, but it's not so much about the spirit of competition as it is about putting on a good show. The archetypal gladiator, in my mind, fights in an arena, right, sandy floors and all that, bare-chested, but with a helmet, has his short sword, a gladius, so not particularly long, some throwing spears, and some nets on his back. And aside from being able to put on a good Carnage show, it's very important that the gladiator be skilled in a variety of different situations that can arise in combat. Because, you know, they're going to encounter a lot of different situations like that. They'll be fighting a variety of creatures and animals, very dangerous, people with exotic weapons very often that are mainly for showmanship, against entire teams of people or with teams and against other teams, and dealing with a variety of environmental hazards that are simulated in the arena. They are basically perfectly trained to be adventurers, except for the fact that they're not really used to carrying around huge amounts of gear and going into the middle of the wilderness. And this could be a very big character flaw that's very interesting, much like, you know, the Duelist, where they are very apt at being adventurers, they have good skills that are required for that kind of work, but at the same time they require a lot of non-combat skills that they just don't have. And if you want to make survival a big aspect of your campaign, I think that's a very good idea to play with. However, me being a fan of urban campaigns or campaigns where survival isn't really that much of an issue, have a different character flaw for gladiators that I really like, which is showmanship. For all their familiarity with a variety of exotic situations, gladiators just think about combat in a different way than most fighters do. While even duelists see battle as a competition where you're supposed to do your best to win, gladiators see battles as stories. They are the bards of the fighting world. They don't primarily make decisions based on strategy and tactics. They make decisions based on hitting the beats of building a good combat narrative. And even if you're in a non-narrative combat situation, if you are trained like this, it is very difficult to let go of that mindset. In a situation like a battle, most of your decisions are spur-of-the-moment decisions that you don't actually think about a lot. They come out of automated responses that are ingrained in you and built in through a long period of training and experience. And if you usually fight in an arena where you're supposed to let off an enemy that you are beating too easily to make the fight more interesting, that kind of snap decision will flow into real, serious combat encounters. And it might also lead you to mispredict the behavior of your enemies, because if someone is beating you too easily, you might assume in some part of your head that if you retreat, they will give you some breathing room. But they don't care about making an interesting narrative, they will just kill you. So showmanship can be a character flaw that doesn't have anything to do with arrogance. Sometimes it's just all about how this particular fighter has been trained. But let's subvert all of this a little bit, shall we? So with all of these classes, there are certain cultural connotations that I have been having throughout this video. You may have noticed this, so how about we transplant those a little bit? I mean, in secondary worlds, we more often than not encounter cultures that are inspired by cultures that have historically existed in real life. And this isn't just because writers are unimaginative, though that probably certainly plays a role from time to time. It's mostly to give players a kind of context with which they are familiar, that they can relate to easily. Instead of having to read up 500 pages of the minutiae of the social manners of a completely original and fascinating culture, you can just say they're like feudal Japanese-ish, and everybody knows kind of what you're talking about, and they will act in accordance with the expectations and tropes associated with that genre. So for the Duelist, the obvious cultural context is French. And yes, I know rapiers are originally Spanish weapons, I don't give a fuck. The proto-Duelist was Cyrano de Bergerac, and even though they got rid of his nose and replaced it with a mustache, he is still the ultimate archetypal duelist. He fucked a lot, and he was basically an artist. So at their core, duelists are competitive, one-on-one combatants. Today, they would be MMA fighters. So depending on the cultural analog or just straight up culture that you transplant them into, their weapons might look very different, as would their style. If you had Zulu-esque kind of culture warriors with the tall shields and the long spears, you'd probably have duels where they would just circle each other slowly until one of them found the definitive opening in the other's defenses, because you only get one shot at throwing that spear. Long build-up of tension, quick release. The same is true about Wild West duels, because, I mean, that's basically the same thing. It's just that they use guns and it takes place at high noon. Knights riding against each other in tournaments. Also Duelist, they're just wearing plate. For the Berserker, I think the core most interesting aspect that we should be thinking about to transplant him is the aspect of the animal warrior. There is, like, more animal warrior type stuff related to the Berserker in Germanic and, like, Nordic folklore, like wolf Zerkers and boar Zerkers, but I think we should adapt those independently and focus on their animalistic aspects in the interest of flavor. So maybe wolf Zerkers would be extremely good at team fighting and pack tactics, whereas boar Zerkers might be wearing like special armor with inbuilt weapons. The Aztecs had a jaguar and eagle warriors because they were considered noble battle animals, but they didn't necessarily fight in a way that was considered akin to those animals. But it would be cool as hell if they did, right? Just you have a fantasy setting, you add magic, boom, suddenly your jaguar warriors are like super stealthy and can just attack, like, from out of nowhere. And your eagle warriors might be able to fly. In other cultures, we could see even other animals, possibly ones that aren't particularly associated with fighting. Scorpion warrior would use, like, long attacks, probably with a spear and, like, poison, and he would be quick, but maybe also carapace. You might have goat warriors that are extremely good at climbing and fighting in rough terrain. But what might a butterfly warrior look like? Or a duck warrior? If your world has genetic engineering, you could even graft animal traits onto these warriors. As for gladiators, their cultural tropes are obviously very deeply Roman. They're very associated with the whole Roman thing. And let's not forget that most gladiators were slaves, which the Romans were very fond of having and making and enslaving. But the context of a purely performative fighter who still gets put in dangerous situations can be easily transplanted into most cultures. In a medieval Europe analog, you might have a troupe of traveling performers who encourage maybe wealthy individuals to sponsor monsters. Just bring their own monsters to the fight and watch the gladiators kill them. Maybe in like an Edo-Japanese kind of setting, you have samurai that were somehow disgraced, probably for bullshit reasons, right? And they just get stripped of all of their titles and their honors and just, you know, made to be completely without honor. And then they are in court having to perform like show battles against everything that the codes that they have subscribed to dictate. And they just do this for the entertainment of the elites. Frankly, even though gladiators are so deeply Roman in the association of their tropes, they're also, like, really common throughout basically every kind of period in human history. And basically, that's it. Thank you very much for watching this system agnostic classes. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Patreon, or maybe Subscribestar, buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. And in that spirit, genuinely, what would a butterfly warrior look like? Like, but make him, like, badass, right? Maybe it's like a dervish type deal? So I'm curious to actually see some opinions in the comments on that. And see you around, cunts!